Whether on the field, on the court, or on the balance beam, there's more to winning than the final score. Hi, I'm Patrick Manning of Black Desert Resort. We recognize the effort it takes to succeed. That's why we are proud to partner with Utah Checkdown, the podcast that tells you the story before the game, then gives you a recap of what happened when it's all over, the grit, the glory, and the disappointments. Join us for stories of Utah's finest athletes and coaches. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you guys again. It's been a bit, partially my fault, partially some other circumstances. My wife's family decided to make a trip to Disneyland the last week of the football season, and it was really hard to bring podcast equipment there. Plus, I'm in Disneyland, not really easy to kind of step away from my family and do a podcast. As much as I love talking to you guys and doing that, that's, family time is important to me, so I had to do that. So, I didn't get anything that week, and then this week, I was sick early on in the week, and I couldn't even talk, and so it was tough to be able to get a podcast out. I was hoping to do a quick recap of the last game of the season. We'll get some of that a little bit today. And then this week has just been chaos with, signing day, as well as Utah hiring an offensive coordinator and everything else associated with Utah athletics. So it's been a wild ride, but I'm back today to do one on a Friday. And, we'll try to get back into more regularity. Now that the football season's over, we may switch to once a week, depending on how this goes. But there's still basketball going, some other things going on. Gymnastics will be kicking off and all that other stuff, too. So we'll try to get all these other sports going in while still keeping an eye on football, because football is kind of a 24/7, 365 sport. That's the way it's gone anymore, and that's what many people care about, and obviously there's a lot to handle. So we'll continue to do that while we bring in these other sports and kind of have some fun with that. So before we jump into today's podcast, let me tell you about our sponsors, Black Desert Resort, where you can truly indulge in luxury your way. Whether you choose a sleek studio or an expansive 4-bedroom suite, you're just moments away from teeing off on a championship golf course. Savoring top-tier dining, relaxing poolside, or exploring the rugged beauty of southern Utah. Whatever thrill you seek, it's right outside your door. Your journey awaits at blackdesertresort.com. Get lost and find luxury. All right, so just once again, another social media plug to follow me on Blue Sky, if that's where you are kind of shifting your social lifestyle now. You can find me at jfur, so jfur.ksl.com. Real easy to find me there. I've been active there as well. I'm not leaving Twitter. There's no intent to leave there, but so I'm going to keep a profile on both and try to give you information the best I can on both platforms. But if you are there, give me a follow there, and I'll try to give you an updates on all that happens. So, let's jump into the podcast today. We're going to talk, a little bit of the recap of the UCF game, since we didn't get a chance to on Monday. We won't spend too much time because it's been, a week now. But then we'll get into some other stuff, talking about Kyle Whittingham's future, the OC hire, kind of what that looks like, the recruiting, what took place this week with early signing day, and kind of what's going on with that. So let's first just jump into that game that took place last Friday. So we're a week away from Utah's final game of the season. Obviously Utah came into this game with a 7-game losing streak. Things weren't going well, missed out on a bowl opportunity. And so this game, for no real reason other than just kind of getting, a win to close out the season, was kind of the main point, right? You want to kind of come out there, and you don't want to be on an 8-game losing streak. I know there's all these stats about Utah hasn't done this or that or whatever with, losing streaks, and that wasn't really on the team's mind. It was more just ending the season on a positive note, right? after the trying season that they had, some of which was kind of to their own doing. It just kind of snowballed, and Utah went on a 7-game losing streak, and so UCF served as kind of the final test. And it's wild because going into this game at the beginning of the season, this felt like one of those games that was going to, I don't want to call it a make or break game, but this was a game that, if Utah was still on the hunt for a Big 12 championship, this game could present a problem, especially with, what Gus Malzahn does with his quarterbacks and running. And, this served as a very difficult test for Utah. Both of these teams obviously weren't in a situation that they liked. Both teams were 4-7. Just not a great spot for either one of these teams after the preseason expectations. It just hadn't worked for UCF. They benched their starting quarterback, switched to new quarterbacks, and try to move things around. And so this was a game where just two teams kind of really looking to get the season over. Utah goes with Luke Batari as their final starter. So for the second straight year, he closes out the season as the team starter. And they end up getting a win, 28-14. The offense wasn't prolific by any means, but it moved the ball slightly better. I wouldn't call it anything great. There were still a lot of struggles, and it was kind of an exercise in futility at times. But Utah's defense came up big. They secured 2 pick-six scores, one early and then one late. And then Luke Batari hit Landon King for his first touchdown of the season, which is wild to me. Landon King, is a rising star in the sport, and unfortunately he was buried a little bit on this roster for whatever reason, based on how this team went. But he ends the season with a touchdown, and it really sent Utah out on a high note, right? Like you can't really put. I don't even know how to describe this. Like, you can't really say what this means to those seniors, right? Obviously, this is not the way that they wanted to end the season. They wanted to be in a bowl, or they wanted to be in a contention for, the Big 12 title game. This is a huge disappointment from where they were at, right? Obviously. But to get the win the way that they did, it absolutely helped. Mekhi Bernard eclipsed the 1,000-yard rushing mark. That's something that he tried to get at the beginning or that was his goal that he had for himself at the beginning of the season, and he was able to do it despite so many odds against Utah, right? I mean, teams stacked the box. The run game play calling wasn't exactly ideal. And still Mekhi Bernard, of all the things that happened this year, is probably one of the biggest lights on the offensive side of the ball, where he was just able to work. He was really essentially the only back. There was guys that were mixed in here, and for whatever reason, they didn't get in there. It was really just the Mekhi Bernard show. And despite, being banged up and having some injuries and leaving the game from time to time, he continued to battle and come out there and do what he needed to. I mean, this was the true definition of what Utah likes to describe as the Utah man, right? He loves everything about it. He obviously had a chance to leave Utah, enter the transfer portal a couple years ago, decided to come back because he loved what he had there. Things changed and allowed him to kind of really hone in on what he does and really just put in the work. I mean, for many years, he was utilized, but he was never the featured back. He was never the guy that they turned to in situations to really kind of get them their yards. And in the season that is gloomy and had a lot of terrible aspects to it, especially on the offensive side of the ball, Mekhi Bernard is the guy that kind of really stands out and really just showed his will to kind of do what he needed to. Obviously, he's looking for the future as well, but he really was indoctrinated into the Utah culture. He really liked being there. He really wanted to win, and his ability to do all that really helped Utah have the success that it had. Honestly, Utah probably doesn't even have one of their wins. I can't remember what week it was, if not for Mekhi Bernard. There's a lot of these games where he kept them in there. Maybe, it was Oklahoma State. He even kept them in that Arizona State game. I know they lost, but he was the only one really fighting in that game when Cam Rising couldn't do anything. And so you really have to give him a lot of credit for that. That's a huge honor for him to be able to pass 1,000-yard rushing mark. It's kind of that unwritten rule that, running backs have to get that 1,000-yard. I don't know what it is. It's, it's just a number, but at the same time, I think it kind of is it shows kind of how much hard work that he put in and what he was able to do. So, great opportunity for him. It worked well. He and the seniors, left on a high note. All the they were excited to sing Utah Man at the end of the game. I mean, this is where they were at. This is what they wanted, and it's something that really put them in a positive light compared to what had happened, for the rest of the season. On top of that, Luke Batari goes out as the starting quarterback with a 2-0 record. So he goes undefeated in Utah history as a starter. Pretty wild that he was put in this situation again. Fifth string guy this year. Last year, I think it might have been fourth. I can't even remember at this point. Fifth, probably. But the fact that he's even in this position to play as a starter in the final game is pretty remarkable, and he did exactly what he needed to be able to get a win. So, that's kind of where that game was at. We don't really need to rehash that. But as part of this game, there was a general vibe, and leading up to this game especially, there was a general vibe that this was going to be Kyle Whittingham's last game, right? This was, all the kind of conversations had led that way. Him talking about it in the press conferences with us had kind of trended that way, especially with his conversations about how Morgan Scalley was going to be heavily involved in the hiring of an offensive coordinator and all the decisions within the program. It just kind of lent itself to, this is a guy that is transitioning, to the new head coach. And it felt that way very much so on the field. I don't think the team played any differently to try to get him the win, but there felt like this general consensus that everybody was kind of working in unison, one, to get the win, but to do this for Kyle Whittingham and his last game. Obviously not the season that he wanted either, wants to go out as a conference champion or at least contend for one. But, if you can at least get a win at the very end of the season, that puts it in a positive light, and you leave feeling like you still accomplished everything. This season wasn't going to, do anything to tarnish his legacy at Utah by any means. But, sometimes when you go out on a sour note like that makes it tough, right? So you get the win. Even everything after the game, there was several groups of fans that were chanting Whittingham's name at the end. They felt it too, right? I mean, there was this vibe, so to speak, that Whittingham was hanging it up after this season. Press conference, he declined to say anything about it, wanted to put this all on the focus of the seniors and allowing them to get the win, the players to get the win, and didn't want to do that. But everything still felt like it was heading that way. And yet, there's been nothing. Nothing's happened. And look, I know everybody's anxious to kind of get the news there. They want to know if Kyle's coming back. They want to understand if he's, hanging it up, whatever that may be. Me amongst that, because I have, I'm trying to figure out that stuff. But this is a very tight knit situation, right? It's Kyle Whittingham and maybe a few other people that know what's going to go on. As of right now, though, that vibe that I was speaking about at the UCF game and leading up into the last part of the season, it feels like it's kind of shifting a little bit. And this is based off of conversations that I've had too, but it's shifting a little bit to where it sounds like Kyle Whittingham may be coming back. Now, I say that knowing that there really hasn't been anything, 100%. It's not official. It's one of those things where it's still up in the air. But it's starting to lean that way where he potentially will come back. Now, with that said, from the time that Utah won that UCF game, he hasn't taken a break. Honestly, this last week has been 100% fully immersed in the offensive coordinator hiring situation. They have been in that building working tirelessly, and I'll get into that in just a second. But they've been working very hard to be able to try to get that. So, Kyle Whittingham, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, is he's trying to get some perspective on the season before he really makes a decision. he hasn't had that chance yet because he's been so fully invested in being able to do that. And I understand that if he wants to walk away, or that was the inclination coming into that final game, that he would just turn this all over to Morgan Scalley and kind of move on. But he's going to be fully invested. This is one of those things that even if he does decide to retire, he's still going to be invested in the program. It's in his contract where he will still be, a special assistant for the next 5 years at least, and he can be invested in the program. So this is one of those things where he's going to do whatever he can to continue that. At the same time, he carries a lot of cachet, right? And so if you can bring in some of these offensive coordinators and you can have them talking to Kyle Whittingham, regardless of if he's coming back or not, that still holds some weight, right? You want him to be able to be in that room and the conversations. He understands that program more than anybody there. Morgan Scalley obviously understands it probably the second best. Maybe that's not easy to quantify, but Morgan Scalley knows it as almost as much as Kyle, but Kyle is the institution, right? He's been there for like 35 years, 20 of it is as a head coach. It's a long time. And so he knows that more than anybody, more than Mark Harlan, who's going to be obviously the ultimate decider in terms of helping, craft contracts and different things there. But this is a situation where he's been fully immersed in that. And so for anybody to really say where Kyle is at is kind of tough. He may be leaning there, right? He may be leaning toward staying because right now he's in the mix of that, and that's kind of where it's at. But I would imagine that now that hiring process is finalized, this becomes the time where he can now kind of take a step back and focus on stuff. Yes, there's a lot of other things going on behind the scenes. There's the transfer portal stuff, and we'll get into that as well. There's all those things that this is the offseason for them, but it's not, right? Like, this is still very much active. The transfer portal opens up in 3 days, and that becomes a crazy, chaotic time, and so he's got to be ready for that. So, whether he makes a decision now in the short term or makes it maybe in January, I don't know. Right? Like, I don't know when that's going to happen. I haven't gotten any indications when that's going to happen. I do know that they have tried to make Morgan much more involved in this process. The hiring of an offensive coordinator, Morgan was involved in that. I think they're trying to, as an athletic department, not fully invest in Kyle or Morgan, because that's not true. Kyle is still the head coach, right? So he's obviously going to have that. But there's many things where, they didn't do a press conference after they signed their recruiting class. And that's always been a staple of Kyle Whittingham, to come in there and talk about his recruiting class. The email that they sent for the press release, so to speak, of hiring of the new offensive coordinator didn't have any quotes from either Kyle Whittingham or Morgan Scalley. Now, these are all, not something that you need to take into consideration in terms of, they're trying to hide it. But at the same time, I think there really is a tough decision here where they're trying to figure out who is going to be the head coach, right? And that's going to come down to Kyle, right? This isn't anybody's going to push him out the door. Mark Harlan's not going to do it. Morgan Scalley's not going to do it. This is Kyle. And if Kyle decides to leave, then he decides to leave on his own accord. If he decides to stay, it's the same thing, right? Nobody's going to do that. Maybe he gets some help from boosters who, does he still get the support? Obviously, these top-end boosters, and all boosters, really, they trust Kyle Whittingham. So I don't think there's any doubts there in terms of not wanting Kyle Whittingham to come back. Obviously, there's things with his control of the offense that I think people want to see different, and, moving towards Morgan Scalley benefits that in terms of him wanting to kind of have a different style of offense and have a little bit less constraints on it. But nobody's going to tell Kyle Whittingham to leave, right? And as much as I've seen on Twitter and other message boards and other stuff that people want Kyle Whittingham to move on, at the same time, you've got your guy that has built a program, forever, and built the culture and done everything to put it into position where it is today. Yes, there are situations where you can hold on too long, right? And not everybody gets to go out on the way that they want to, and Kyle's getting that opportunity as best as anybody that he can, where he can go out on his own terms. But at the same time, that becomes the difficult challenge of where he has to say, in his perspective and what he said, where he's going to do the best for the university, that still may be him. And that's a tough conversation to have with yourself, right? Am I still the best opportunity to coach? I don't want to call him prideful, but he understands that he's in a good position, right? He's got a good thing going on, and if you can continue that, that's great. But you also don't want to stand in the way. And that's the conversation that he has to have. Does he feel like he's standing in the way of where there could be future potential with Morgan? Yes, Morgan is unproven, right? We obviously have seen him as a defensive coordinator, and things change when coordinators get made as a head coach and they have to make all these decisions. But Morgan has been around a lot of this stuff, right? He's been involved in a lot of this process, especially as of late. But still, he's unproven. And I personally believe that he has the potential to be a great head coach. Obviously, a lot of people look at the records of the guy after the guy. That is a challenge, right? And that's something that is going to be a tall task for Morgan when that time comes. And so that's tough. But that's where this program has to look at it right now, right? They have to say, is Kyle Whittingham still the best option? And if he is, then he's going to stay, especially if he still feels like he can stay. But if they feel like they're at a point where Morgan Scally can kind of take over and do that, then they can do that. Now, that's not to say that, like I said, Kyle may stay on too long. We'll see. It's hard to look in the future and understand when is the right time to leave. But I think those are those questions that Kyle's going to be answering for himself in the next few days, few weeks, whatever that may be, whenever he gets that time for perspective. I don't know that there really is an easy time for that. Utah football will meet early January to kind of start their season again. And so you have to imagine that from now until that early January date, that first week, or I think it's first, whatever they meet, a decision has to be made, right? Generally speaking, you can't go into the next year thinking that it's going to be Kyle Whittingham and then suddenly switch. That's not to say that it can't, but I think that's kind of that in-between period where they kind of Kyle has to make that decision. And we'll see what happens. This is a tough time of the year, obviously the holidays and the transfer portal and all that stuff, but really curious to see how it goes. As I said, the vibe coming into this week, to that week and leading that game was that was Kyle Whittingham's last game. I think everybody kind of felt that. That's where it was. It's been shifting to Morgan Scally and all that. However, there is a real possibility that Kyle comes back and he's still there. So don't be surprised either way. I don't know that you're in a world of hurt if Kyle decides to come. I mean, that's crazy to say, right? Like, this is a guy that has meant so much to this institution, and to have Kyle Whittingham come back for as long as he wants to come back, that's always a good thing. Now, with that said, there does have to be things that change, and he's mentioned that, right? He understands that there needs to be more fluidity with that offense. He understands that it needs to be more simple, and it needs to simple in the sense that you need guys that can come in and plug and play. You can't expect in this era of the transfer portal to come in and have a very difficult offense where you can, mature and marinate in it for a couple of years before you really excel in it your final year or final 2 years or whatever that case may be. You've got to come in and you've got to be able to have something simple enough that they can just learn it from the jump, and complex enough that you're not just giving everything up to the other team. The reality is, though, is Utah has been so simple in terms of what they've run that they've become so easy to kind of diagnose, right? Every defense understands what Utah was doing on offense, and that's why it became such a challenge for them to be able to do what they wanted to, because any coach worth their weight in coaching, whatever you want to call that, they understood what they were going to do. If us, in the media or fans understood what they were going to do, that's kind of shows how simple it is, right? So it was a complex offense under Andy Ludwig that took the players forever to learn, but it was simple enough in the sense that everybody knew what they were going to do. And so it really didn't do anything, especially when you didn't have, a proven quarterback that allowed you to kind of change some of those wrinkles. Cam Rising was able to be the great equalizer there, where he could see the defense and kind of see what was going on, and pre-snap reads, whatever that may be, to be able to help that. That's what Utah didn't have. Now, moving forward, they have to have something different. So transitioning that, I guess, to the offensive coordinator hire, because that's kind of where this is going to be. Whether it's Kyle Whittingham or Morgan Scally, you've now got a new offensive coordinator that's coming in, and you kind of have to let him be himself, right? If you limit him and try to go the traditional Utah way as of past, it doesn't really matter, and you're kind of stuck in the same thing. So I'm really curious to see if Kyle Whittingham comes back, what his involvement in this offense does. If he's learned his lessons, if he can allow them to be able to be more dynamic, be more simple, be less conservative, we'll say, and trying to do what he needs to be able to just be aggressive, right? I mean, this is a team that if they could find a way to be aggressive, there's not many teams that can stop them because Utah's defense has been so lights out. That's what I've always felt, that this team could be more aggressive because of what they've got on defense. You can do things that most teams aren't able to do because you've got the horses on the other side of the ball to be able to do it. But instead, Utah builds up a lead, sits on it, or they kind of drag it out, try to play the clock. Like, there's a lot of things that you can change here. I don't know that all of that's going to change if Kyle comes back, but there are some things that they potentially can change. But that's a tall task to have. So, looking at this OC hiring process, it's been a week, right? It's been a challenge. That's obviously the number one priority that Utah had coming into the offseason, immediately after the game, immediately in terms of, this is the first thing that they did. They jumped into the offensive coordinator search. And early on, they had kind of circled the wagon, so to speak, around Ben Arbuckle. He was the offensive coordinator at Washington State. Prolific, right? Like, this is one of the best offenses in the country. High tempo, a lot of passing, really effective offense that did well. Obviously, this is kind of what Washington State's had for years, not with Arbuckle, but just that kind of style. And so this became a very attractive thing. Morgan Scalley was good friends with Arbuckle in terms of the coaching community and everything. And so this felt like a great transition to kind of bridge that gap, whatever happens with Kyle or Morgan, whatever, right? And by all indications, the conversation was moving along with Arbuckle, but he was involved with Oklahoma as well. Now, Oklahoma was always the biggest player in this. There were some conversations had that Arbuckle was really involved with Utah, and I'm not saying that he wasn't, but this, I would say that Utah was probably used more as leverage for the Oklahoma job. That's not to say that Utah wasn't in the mix here, but I think this was always kind of the first vision was Oklahoma for Arbuckle, at least based on some of the conversations that I've had. That's kind of the way this went. Utah still felt really good about this, and there was a legit chance that they could have pulled Arbuckle in, but while the Arbuckle was more focused on Oklahoma. And once those conversations panned out with Oklahoma, it was kind of a done deal. Okay, so you move on, right? That was Monday, Tuesday, whatever those dates were. They're all a blur to me at this point. Every single day was a new offensive coordinator, and so it's been kind of wild. But you move on, right? There's several options out there on on that front, and so Utah had plenty to go. But they pivoted their kind of focus on Mac Leftwich, the offensive coordinator at Texas State, another up-and-coming coordinator with a lot of talent, been able to showcase a lot of what he was able to do, just a great asset that worked. Now, this is the coordinator that Utah really probably went the furthest with. They were in deep conversations with him, flew him out to Salt Lake City, had conversations with him about everything. At the end of the day, the conversations broke down based on the contract. I've heard a few different things. My understanding is it was probably more based on the timeline, or not timeline, but the length of the contract that probably was the biggest decider. But honestly, it was kind of semantics, because at the end of the day, Leftwich is a Texas guy. He's from that area. Texas is where he's at, right? Texas State, that's exactly where he wants to be. And so pulling him out of Texas to come to Utah was always going to be a challenge. With that said, this one was actually further down the road, right? And, I'm curious what those conversations were like with the contract negotiations, what was going on there. Regardless, it broke down, and he ended up taking the Texas Tech job. I understand a lot of fans are frustrated that you lost out to Texas Tech and you feel like you're a better program than whatever. It doesn't really matter. The reality is he was a Texas guy. He wanted to stay in Texas, and Utah had to kind of give him the moon, so to speak, to be able to get him to Utah. Now, I don't think that's really what they were going for. Obviously, Scalley liked him as well. all of these candidates Scally jived with, from what I've heard. So, these all, trended well. Everything was moving that way. Leftwich was honestly like, it felt like it was inches away from kind of getting a deal done, but nothing had really materialized once those conversations happened. And so things broke down, like I said, and he accepted the Texas Tech offensive coordinator job, and so Utah moved on to its next one. There were several candidates in there. UNLV's offensive coordinator. There were a bunch of other guys that were in that mix, but for the most part, they pivoted and moved to their next best option that they felt was Jason Beck at New Mexico. You may be familiar with the name Jason Beck. He was a former BYU quarterback, no relation to John Beck, even though they share the same last name and they did play in the same timeline. But Jason Beck, he's been a coach at BYU, mostly as a quarterback coach. He followed Bronco Mendenhall around for a while. By the way, Bronco Mendenhall got hired on at Utah State as their head coach, so that'll be really interesting to kind of see how that goes. But he followed him to Virginia, where he was able to be a quarterback coach there and did some things there. And then, eventually came to New Mexico, where he was the offensive coordinator and the QB coach there as well. And in this last year, he had a great season. New Mexico obviously is not a place where football has really thrived. It's honestly been one of the harder jobs in all of college football, and it's been a challenge. And yet, Mendenhall turned that program around. Beck got that offense really, really humming. Honestly, this was a situation where New Mexico led, or they're fourth in the country in total offense with 484.3 yards. I mean, this is a team that did really well. So Beck, he's 44, relatively young in the industry. Similar age with Morgan Scally, a guy that is adaptable to the rosters, to his strengths of his players. And when you say that, Andy Ludwig said that he was adaptable to his players as well, and he is. The problem was his offense was so complicated to learn that adaptability, that's a lot to say kind of in that, yeah, you get it. The adaptability was a bit of a challenge because it meant players had to understand it, right? So you can have your best player out there on the field, but if he can't understand the offense, he's not going to play. And so then it just became complicated. So you've got Jason Beck. He's officially hired on last night, Thursday night. This worked out really well. Obviously, the BYU connection has some people kind of wondering, why this feels like just a Whittingham hire, and, it just feels like they can't be creative. If you took out that he was a BYU quarterback or that he's coached in this state, he did coach at Weber State as well, honestly, this is one of the better, hires in college football. I think the connections to his state in Utah kind of confuse people in terms of this is a similar hire to what Utah always does. They don't think outside of the box. If anything, if you didn't have those connections, he's still one of the top names out there that teams are going to be coming after. So, take that with a grain of salt of the whole Utah connection, the BYU connection, whatever you want to do. Jason Beck has been an up-and-coming offensive coordinator. He's still relatively inexperienced, right? Like, he's only been an offensive coordinator twice, and there was only 1 year apart. So once at Syracuse, once at New Mexico. And I'll get into kind of how that worked and kind of what his style is like, but he's still relatively young. So there's still a lot to prove, but there's a lot of upside there because he's a guy that likes to be able to utilize his best players. He's got a system that fits a lot of what kind of college football has been around. So a lot of these players coming in, from high school or from other teams, it's a much easier plug and play system that players understand. And so there's a big advantage here of what he's able to bring. That's why they were so attracted to him. And so I think there's a lot of upside here. Now, like I said, still a little bit unproven in the sense that he hasn't done it that long, but what he was able to do with New Mexico alone, a place that, like I said, doesn't really have a lot of success, kind of shows what they're able to do. So we'll see what that is. But let's kind of look at kind of what he likes to do. So his offensive schemes, he likes to operate in the spread. So you're going to see a lot of the spread concepts and everything that is tied to that, while relying on the RPO. He loves the RPO, and there's a big reason for that, and that's because he wants a quarterback that is going to run. And so if you can utilize that RPO with a dynamic quarterback that is this bigger guy that can kind of, break away for runs, this becomes an explosive offense for him, and he's able to cook, right? At New Mexico, as I said, he had the fourth best total offense in the country at 484.3 yards. Their rushing offense was fifth in the country at 253.6 yards. That's largely because their quarterback, Devin Dampier, he rushed for 1,100 yards, almost 1,200 yards, had 19 touchdowns, and averaged 7.52 yards every carry. That's incredible for a quarterback, right? He did well. On top of that, he passed for 2,700 yards, almost 2,800 yards, and had 12 passing touchdowns. He did have 12 interceptions, and he only completed at 57.9%, but as a complete package, he did phenomenal for them and got them everywhere that they needed to. So you can look at it and say their passing offense was only 63rd in the country, averaging 230 yards, but at the same time, he was effective, right? Their second best rusher, I should say, was a running back, and that's Eli Sanders, and he rushed for 1,063 yards and 9 touchdowns. He, too, averaged 7 yards per carry. So regardless of what happens, Jason Beck knows what he needs to do in the run game. But that's not to say that he's just a run-first kind of guy. Now, that's a huge aspect of it, right? With the RPO, obviously, that's going to be in there. But there's a lot of elements here where they use that to their advantage to open up that passing game. That's exactly what Utah needs to do to be able to get more comfortable and to be able to have that success. Some of this doesn't even have to be, for these chunk yardage type plays in terms of like passing downfield. Yes, he still attacks downfield, right? This isn't an air raid offense, right? He's not going to necessarily open it up and just pass for 400 yards. But at the same time, he wants a quarterback. He calls it the Thorderback. And where this comes from, essentially, this is back when he was at BYU and coaching Taysom Hill. If you remember, Taysom Hill had phenomenal games against Texas. For whatever reason, Texas just, he found ways to just destroy them and ended up rushing for something like 200-plus yards against Texas. Obviously, you remember him leaping over a Texas guy, and that it caught BYU fans with excitement, and they love that moment, right? It showcased Taysom Hill's ability, and you're seeing that still in the NFL. The guy just is an impossible guy to bring down. And after the game, Mac Brown, who is the head coach, said that they got beat by Thor. And so ever since then, that's kind of the mantra that Beck has taken with him. He wants a guy that is like Thor, a bigger-bodied quarterback, a guy that can run and that can just do a lot. Now, you're not getting Taysom Hill all the time, right? He's a unique guy, right? And obviously his passing wasn't as well as his running, and you've seen that in the NFL as well. He's become a great asset, but his passing hasn't been what he's been known for most of the time. That's not to say you can't have a great passing quarterback, but the emphasis here is he wants a quarterback that can run. He wants a physical quarterback. And so you want somebody that can take the hits, but more importantly, you want a guy that can understand how to use that RPO to his advantage. He wants to be able to make that read. You want to be able to get him, and you want him to be able to, outrun the defensive end that he's supposed to read, or, hand it off the right way, use that to set up a pass, whatever it may be, where you offload it off as an option, whatever it may be. That's how he operates. And so if you're in Utah's offense, you look at what Utah has on staff. Now, with that said, we'll get into the transfer portal here in a second, and Utah's gonna be completely different, to be honest with you. But if you're looking at the offense, and let's just go with the quarterbacks that they do have. So you've got Brandon Rose, who I don't know how much he's going to factor in next year simply because of his injury. The Liz Frank injuries can take a while to recover from, 8 to 12 months, whatever that may be. For him to be ready by fall camp next year is going to be a tall task. And so, whether he's in there, I don't know. But this system would fit him very well. He's a bigger-bodied quarterback. He can run effectively. If you can utilize that RPO well, this opens up a huge game. You saw that with him being able to run that against BYU. He was able to do that very well. So you've got Brandon Rose that can be an effective quarterback instantly in this offense. I believe, right? Like, we don't know fully, but I believe based on his skill sets, this would be great. Isaac Wilson also could be great in this offense. Now, the difference with Isaac Wilson in this is he's not quite the bigger-bodied quarterback that he relies on. But that's not to say that he can't. Isaac Wilson, at Corner Canyon, they ran a lot of RPO stuff. That he's familiar with that. He's comfortable with that. That's actually fits his model better. Or his skill set, I should say. Model, that's not what, you know what I'm saying. That fits his skill set more. And so if you can get him in here, and let's say that he is your starting quarterback, there's going to be a competition. Utah's going to go to the transfer portal. We're just going to go with that, okay? So, who knows who the quarterback will be? But I'm just saying, if Isaac is put in this mix, he can do it as well. You want to showcase more of his running game, he can do it. You can get here and allow him to be able to do something that he's much more familiar with, more comfortable with. And so what Beck brings is already something that fits Utah's system. Kyle wants to run the ball, right? We get that. That's always been, I don't want to call it a knock because it's been effective for Utah, but it's always been they don't like to pass the ball. They like to run the ball, establish the run first, whatever. This is a similar model where they do like to establish the run, but there's a lot more flexibility with it, I'd say, with the RPO. You can do a lot more with what they've got in this system with Beck. And so it's easy to learn. Like I said, it's something that players have been playing with a long time. They understand the RPO. They understand the spread. These are very common concepts for a lot of collegiate players, high school players. And so you get something that they understand, that you can vibe with, right? And so this becomes a much easier situation for them. Now, if you can get the right quarterback, like he had with Dampier in New Mexico, you can do some serious damage. If Utah can find a running back that can complement a running quarterback, and then you can get some wide receivers that can complement that as well, this becomes a very dangerous offense for Utah. And look, we don't want to get, ahead of ourselves, but this becomes a great opportunity for Utah. If they can find an offense that can be dynamic and have what they need to do, just, as we've said before, even just a moderate amount of offense, you've got a defense that can do exactly what you need to be able to compete. Now, Utah's going to lose a lot of defensive players, just senior laden as it stands. But, this is a team that has always invested in the defensive side of the ball. And so if you can combine these two things, this becomes a great opportunity for Utah. They still have to get their guys, right? The transfer portal, it's churning. It's going to happen, and you've got to find guys that can be able to kind of fit that mold. This isn't just something that suddenly Beck comes in here and Utah's suddenly this title contender. There's going to be a lot of questions, right? And coming into next season, I guarantee you Utah's not going to be picked to win the conference. But for good reason, and they shouldn't. This is a team that has the potential if they can continue to move forward and get the right guys in the transfer portal, but there's a lot of unknowns about this team, especially coming off of these years with the offense. But I think Beck gives you a lot of upside, if not for just the plug-and-play type style alone. And if you can get the right types of quarterback or quarterbacks, you've got to build that room, you can be in a very strong position. They've got the talent, right? Like, they've got players that can do it. They've always been able to recruit those guys. They've just got to be able to take it to the next level. And they've got to be able to have a quarterback that can run the offense that they need to be able to be effective. So really curious to see what happens there. Devin Dampier, their quarterback at New Mexico, he is in the transfer portal. The odds-on favorite is that he would come to Utah. I would imagine he'd want to follow his offensive coordinator, but he's going to be an attractive name out there. There's going to be a lot of teams that want to have a running quarterback. Utah's not the only team that's going to run an RPO, right? Or wants a dual threat quarterback that comes in. These are dime a dozen for in terms of what teams want, but that doesn't mean you get an effective one all the time. There's guys that can run, but not to this level. And so if you can find a guy that can effectively do it, you're going to pay a lot of money. So you have to you have to figure out if Dampier really likes Beck and wants to follow him, and if Utah can make it work and pay him the right amount or whatever that may be, then it can all work. But he's gonna have other suitors, right? It's not a done deal that just because his offensive coordinator went to Utah that he's suddenly going to follow suit. There's a strong correlation there, and that's a good opportunity. And if Utah is able to get Dampier, I think that instantly makes that offense better. That's no slight to Brandon Rose or Isaac Wilson, but you have a proven player that can do it. Now, granted, you're coming at the P4 level, right, instead of the Mountain West, but I don't think that there's that much of a change there. There is a change, right? Like, I don't want to say that there's not a ton. There is a change, but I think he can effectively do it. And I think in the Big 12, he can effectively do it. And so if Dampier is a guy that Utah is able to target and get in there, that's great. There's other quarterbacks that they can get out there and they can utilize with this. The reality here, though, is Beck will do what he needs to be able to make his offense work. That's not to say that he doesn't want to establish the run with a running quarterback. He does. But at the same time, he'll do what he can with whatever's there, right? And as long as you can run, his offense the way that works, they're going to be fine. So, but on top of that, you have to see how Kyle Whittingham, or if it's Morgan Scalley, allows this offense to go. Because there's a heavy emphasis in run, I have to imagine this is very attractive to Kyle Whittingham. This allows them to get into the play actions that they love. They love to control the clock. They love chunk yardage plays off of the run. This becomes a perfect fit. It's a lot of kind of utilizing some of the old style of being able to run the ball while still kind of embracing the newer modern type offenses of collegiate football, which is going to kind of be the blending factor of Kyle Whittingham and Morgan Scalley. And so you're getting, a lot of optimism from this type of a hire. Once again, it's still unproven, right? Like, it's easy to sit here and talk in December 6th. We've got a whole season away that we don't understand of what it's going to look like. What's the spring going to look like and how they're going to get their guys. Who's even going to be on the roster? That's kind of where this is going to be. So it's easy to say right now that this could be a very advantageous thing for Utah, but there's a lot of factors that go into this, and so we'll see what goes on. Also in the transfer portal for New Mexico is Luke Wysong, their leading receiver. He had 840 yards last year and a touchdown. Maybe Utah kicks the tires on him as well with being able to understand that system and everything there, and maybe the connections. There's a lot of opportunities there. I don't think you want to fully take all of New Mexico's players and think that everything's going to be great, but that's not to say that you can't, right? You've got this opportunity, and if you can do the right things, and these are the guys that fit your model and fit your culture and everything, this becomes a great opportunity to be able to have people that understand the system already. They can come in there and do exactly what they need to be able to make Utah an efficient offense. Whether they can bring in a running back, that's a different question, and we'll get into that. So New Mexico, he did well. Just as kind of a note on his Syracuse time, a lot of people will look at his numbers there, and they don't look as great, right? Like, total offense, they were ranked 99th, only averaged 343.3 yards. Rushing offense, they were 48th. Their running back rushed for, 1,064 yards, 9 touchdowns. Their quarterback, or at least their main quarterback, rushed for 469 yards and 8 touchdowns. Their passing offense wasn't great, 116th. The leading receiver there was actually Damian Alford, who is now on Utah's roster. He had 610 yards last year, or the year before, and 3 touchdowns. But the real problem there was this was a team that was absolutely bitten by the injury bug. They were similar to Utah in that 2023 season. They didn't have a lot of players that could kind of do what they needed to. So it's not easy to kind of look at their stats and say, okay, this is a comparison to I'm not going to say he's terrible, but, he wasn't a great offensive coordinator in Syracuse, and he was a great offensive coordinator in New Mexico. It's tough, right? Like, there's a lot of things that go in your way in one situation and where they don't in another, and so it's hard to know. I mean, Syracuse was at a point where they were using a tight end as a quarterback. That's how depleted they were. As much as Utah's been depleted, they've been able to stay with some quarterbacks, so it hasn't been an easy situation for them in Syracuse that season when he was the offensive coordinator. But he's been able to, coach up quarterbacks. He's been able to do what he can to be able to help those offenses. But from that standpoint, yes, you don't have a huge body of work as his time as an offensive coordinator. And so it's hard to really get a read for what he can do. But if you can do something like that at New Mexico, that generally bodes well for what you could do at a Power 4 level, right? This is what happens all the time, though, is you can hire on guys and they just don't fit, or they don't have the same opportunities available to them at a higher level, right? It's why you see some of these coaches that coach in a G5 level and they're just dominating, and then they get a P4 job, and suddenly it becomes a much different situation, and they can't seemingly get the same success. It's tough at the Power 4 level, right? And so we'll see what happens. I think everything is going in Utah's favor here. I'm not here to just speak positivity into this. I think there are some real challenges here. But I think this is a great opportunity for Utah, and I think this is a hire that should make Utah fans happy. I think this really complements what Utah can do, and I think they've got an upside here with whatever happens on offense. And so we'll see what spring looks like. I know that's just a watered down version of this, but I think there's some great opportunities ahead, and we'll continue to talk about that. Hopefully we get a chance to talk to him before spring. I don't know if they'll allow us to do that. They generally don't bring in media to talk to position coaches or offensive coordinators ahead, but depending on kind of the structure of what this team looks like, if Kyle is leading it or if Morgan's leading it or whatever is happening, that may change things. So let's transition real quick to the early signing day. This week was early signing day period for the NCAA. Utah was heavily involved in that. This honestly, this has become kind of the new just signing day period. Most players are signed in this early signing day. Get it out of the way. You've got your class ready, and you're ready to go for spring with many of these guys enrolling early. And so that works. On Wednesday, Utah signed 21 players. It's a bigger class that they generally don't have. They've tried to stick a little bit lower than that, but with the changes to the roster limits, they've been able to get more. They did sign wide receiver Tavian McNair on Thursday, so that bumps it to 22, and then they're expected to add another on Saturday in Bryson Baker. At least that's trending that way, and so that would put them at 23 for this class, with a heavy emphasis on the defense so far. But if you get Baker, that's kind of a 50-50 split of offense-defense, so that's kind of there. The challenge here with this is, of those 22, 23 players, depending on what that final number is, we don't really know what's going to happen in terms of who are early signees because Utah hasn't said anything. We didn't get a press conference with Kyle to kind of talk about this, to kind of see what's going on. It's kind of unknown, who are going to leave on missions, that kind of stuff. To my understanding, this isn't a huge mission class. Maybe one or two guys, if I've done my research correctly and talked to the right people. So it's not a huge class that way in terms of having players leave on missions. But you've got, some guys that are going to enroll early. Others, we'll wait to see in fall. But I'm curious to see exactly on what that breakdown is going to be. It's not easy to kind of always get this without talking to all of these players, and honestly, I just don't have the time to do that. That's not my main focus, and so I'm not able to kind of get into that as much. But curious to see if we'll get to know what is going on there and kind of how that shakes out. But some of the biggest names that Utah was able to get in this was one of the best names was a linebacker in Christian Thatcher. He's the leading tackler in the state of Nevada. Broke records. I mean, this is a guy that was committed to Utah, excited about Utah, really kind of fits the mold of what Utah wants to do, especially in the linebacker position. And so for him to be kind of one of your standout guys bodes well for Utah moving forward, right? Whether he's able to, be a year one player or impact player remains to be seen. I mean, this is tough to be able to get into that, but I think you're going to find a lot of these guys that are going to be effective and make an opportunity, especially on the defensive side of the ball early on. Outside of that, you had Racine Gilroy. This is a 4-star running back from Texas. This guy had a tremendous amount of offers. He, all of your top Power 5, Power 4 schools, Oregon, Ole Miss, Georgia, Texas, Ohio State, all of these types of schools had given him an offer. Now, look, whenever we read off these offer sheets, not all of them are fully, pushing for this guy. And so it's not always a one-to-one comparison that he, shunned Georgia and decided to come to Utah. Yes, he had an offer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that was heavily pursued, right? It really came down to Utah and Ole Miss. Obviously still a big name, obviously in the SEC, and so to win over Ole Miss is a big thing. You want to be able to have those. Honestly, a few years ago, Utah was losing out to those, right? Like they'd be kind of in the top 3 or top 2 or whatever it is, and always lose out to the bigger named programs. And so this was a great win for Utah, especially with the depth or the lack of depth that Utah has at running back now. He becomes a great asset there. In terms of adding that depth, whether he's able to contribute, year one, once again, is hard to know, but, a lot of upside there. Curious to see kind of what happens, but, great asset there. And then another 4-star. These are all consensus 4 stars. There's other guys on this that have, a 4-star rating from, a select recruiting service, but these are the 4-star rated guys in consensus. And so the majority of them have a 4-star. Utah had 3. The last one is Cyrus Polu, Desert Hills linebacker. Once again, another talent. He got a huge rating bump coming into signing day. Talented kid, should once again, similar model, fit really well at Utah on the defensive side of the ball. And so great opportunity for Utah there to load up on the defensive side of the ball. One other note that I'll mention here is Utah got Dylan Curtis. He's a kicker, and I know this doesn't always, I know kickers are always kind of the funny thing where people are, don't really care, but I think Utah cares a ton on this one, more so because you want consistency. Obviously, want a guy that can kick it out of the end zone, touchbacks. There's a lot that goes on, and I feel like this has been an underrated position for Utah lately. But you signed the number 1 kicker in the country, 6 stars. There's a different rating system for kickers. I don't know why there's a different rating system. I don't know why they can't be fit into the same model as a 24/7 or an Rivals or On3, but this is the nature of the beast. For some reason, kickers get their own rating. He's a 6-star as a place kicker and a 5-star as a punter. So you can do a lot with him. But talented kid, a lot of excitement from people for him. Local kid. So I think that bodes well as well, and people are happy about that. So that's kind of your class right there. It's hard to get too excited about any guys until they fully get here and we get to see them. I think some of these guys will be contributors early, and others are going to be more of a project and take some time. Utah did get 2 quarterbacks in here, and so we'll see kind of how they factor into that room and everything. But I don't think there's a name there like an Isaac Wilson was last year where you expected him to kind of have an impact early. But even then, as you saw with Isaac, being a true freshman QB is tough. So don't expect those guys to really factor in, at least for a while, but you're at least building depth. You're continually going through the high school ranks to try to get these guys in, and maybe one of them will surprise you and they become in the mix. But I think more of those other players are probably going to be in the mix early to kind of see what goes on. So moving into the transfer portal. So it was pretty quiet early on after the season for Utah. We're going to start seeing many more names come out as the month progresses. December 9th is officially when the transfer portal opens, and then they've got till, I believe it's December 28th. I forgot to make that note. December 28th, where you can put your name in the portal, and then after that, you have to wait for the spring period. But players can put their name in the transfer portal now, or at least intend to put their name in the portal. But on December 9th, so in 3 days from now, that's when it opens, and that's when chaos is going to unleash, right? You're going to see a ton of players in there. You're going to see a ton of players moving around. And it's going to be a crazy month to be able to kind of see what happens. But so far, 6 players from Utah. And, by the time you listen to this, there could be even higher number. It's hard to know because this is a changing thing all the time. 6 players have entered the portal. So you've got Jalen Glover, running back, Vili Taufatafua. I had it, and then I just didn't really work with that today. defensive lineman, defensive end. He's in the portal. Anthony Woods, another running back. He's the one that transferred in last year, was injured, so we didn't even get to see him. Don't really know anything about him outside of, he was expected to be a good running back before injured. But he's gone. You got CJ Blocker, corner, Keo Akana, defensive end, and Dijon Stanley, another running back. So that's 3 running backs in the transfer portal. That really decimates Utah's running back room. Right now they have Mike Mitchell and Hunter Andrews. So that's kind of it. That's not to say that this, it didn't need to be there. I think this was where Utah was probably going to go, right? None of these are really surprising to me. There's going to be some other names that are coming out that I've heard that may be surprising to some people and maybe not, but there's going to be some impact players in there, and it's going to be tough, but that's the nature of this business. And after the year that Utah had, you're going to see some guys that are looking for better opportunities. That's just the nature of it. Defensively, Utah's going to stay relatively the same. You've got guys that are in there. I forgot to put Sione Fotu in there. He's in the transfer portal as well. That's a linebacker for Utah, so I forgot to add his name in there. So that's 7. Can't even do my own math, man. What am I even doing? It's been a long week. But on the defensive side, I mean, I think things are much more established there in terms of consistency, and the guys that transfer off of the defense are generally guys that just aren't getting playing time. But you're generally keeping the guys that are going to be your starters. You've already gotten commitments from a lot of these guys on Twitter that they're announcing that they're coming back. A Cam Calhoun, a Smith Snowden, Logan Fano, Spencer Fano on the offensive side of the ball, the Caleb Lomu. Like there's a lot of guys that are coming back that are your starting caliber players that are going to be great for Utah. But this is going to be a huge, I'll call it a purge maybe of the team, and it's going to kind of be a complete makeover of what Utah's had. And it's not going to be fully transfer portal. A lot of this is seniors, right? I mean, Utah had a massive senior class. And so just looking at the roster, I have a spreadsheet that I track all these players and kind of have it over, and it looks, blank. There's just so many players that aren't on the team anymore simply because they've moved on from their senior year. So we'll see what happens. Obviously, as some of these players move out as part of the transfer portal, there's still some that could potentially declare for the NFL draft. The two names that I would say is probably at the top of that list is Keanu Tenavasa. He was hurt a lot this year, so that may limit some of what he's able to do, but he has the talent to be able to pursue an NFL career. He had talked to us before the season ended that he was going to wait to hear what his NFL grade was, or kind of where they projected him before he made a decision. But then there's Landry Barton, right? He's eligible to be in the NFL draft. I know some people have a mixed response to him and what he did this year, but by all accounts, solid player, really has the potential to, continue that in the NFL, follow in the line of his two brothers. And so we'll see what happens there. But for the most part, this is a defense that's going to stay relatively intact. New guys are going to step in to fill those positions. For example, like a Dallas Vakalaki is probably going to fill in for a Junior Tafuna. You've got guys there. Defensive end is going to, one of these guys, whether it's John Henry Daly or Paul Fitzgerald or Cash Dillon, those guys are going to step in, opposite of Logan Fano and kind of move in. But for the most part, this is a team that on the defensive side is pretty solid. Offense will be, continue to make over, and we'll see what happens with the transfer portal there. So curious to see what happens. Don't be too surprised. I mean, I know everybody wants to make a lot of problems out of a transfer portal, but the reality is this is a great opportunity for players and coaches. Some of these players just aren't getting the playing time. Some of them want better opportunities, whatever that may be. I mean, I know people get upset with it, but it's the same as if you wanted a better opportunity in a job. Should you have to stay there if you don't like it? No, you should have an opportunity to seek employment elsewhere. So, let these players have what they need to, and I think it's going to be a good thing. Utah's generally done well with upgrading from the transfer portal. I don't think that's going to change this year. I think they still have a great opportunity to upgrade this year, barring them losing, big name players. But most of those big name players were seniors. And so that's where you lost them. Cam Rising is still technically in the mix on whether he comes back, and his decision is still unknown. I don't know what that would mean for Utah if he does decide to come back. I know obviously with where he's at that people would be excited for that, but at the same time, I think there's many that want to move on as well, and you want to be able to kind of progress. So if he comes in as maybe a depth guy, I think that helps, but I wouldn't guarantee him as a starter at this point. And this is just me speculating, but I think you've got a great opportunity at hand and trying to get this. The real question is just the funds. Utah, like all the schools in the country now, will soon have to pay players as part of the athletic department's funds, and then there's NIL on top of that, and the NIL stuff will change. We'll try to get into that a little bit more. But the reality is we still don't really have a ton of details on how Utah's going to operate. Schools can, do $20 million for their players, and Kyle had said that they will have a much better pool for that stuff than they've had in the past, because it does come from athletic dollars. But how that breakdown is, it's hard to know. So we'll see there. Just outside of that, this week is a busy week. Utah volleyball got a win last night in the NCAA tournament. They're going to have another match tonight against Marquette at 7 p.m. And then Utah men's basketball plays St. Mary's on Saturday. A great quad one opportunity for Utah. This would be a great opportunity for them to kind of showcase their talent and ability to kind of take the next step forward. And then the women's team on Sunday plays Princeton at the Huntsman Center at 2 p.m. So busy week for the Utah beat. A lot of different things going on. But I appreciate you tuning in. I know it's been a wild time, but we'll try to get you through it and try to get all the updates and kind of everything there. So with that, we'll sign off today, and then we'll come back again next week and potentially have some more stuff to talk about transfers and everything else, and we'll kind of jump into some other sports and get into that. So thanks for listening. Appreciate it. Have a great day.